Hi, and welcome everyone. Delighted that you could join us this evening for the book launch and talk with Andrew Feenberg, Marcuse, and the New Left. It's going to be a book launch for The Ruthless Critique of Everything Existing, Nature and Revolution, and Marcuse's Philosophy of Praxis. Andrew will be available to sell some books and sign them after the talk tonight. I just wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My name is Adam Johal. I'm Director of SFE's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. And I'd also really like to thank the School of Communication. Dr. Stuart Points is here, my colleague with the Community Engaged Research Initiative, and also the Institute for the Humanities for sponsoring this event this evening. Before I introduce Andrew, just wanted to let you also know about an event on Thursday evening at 7. In this very room, Dr. Svetlana Matvienko will be giving a talk on nuclear colonialism on Thursday night here at 7 p.m. Really excited to have Andrew with us. I've had Andrew as a guest on the Below the Radar podcast a couple of times. He's visited us at the Vancouver Institute for Social Research. Andrew studied with Herbert Marcuse at the University of California, San Diego. He served as Canada Research Chair in Philosophy and Technology in the School of Communication at SFU, currently Professor Emeritus. Also served as Director of the Program at the College International de Philosophie in Paris. His books include Questioning Technology, Transforming Technology, Between Reason and Experience, The Philosophy of Praxis, and Technosystem, The Social Life of Reason, and now, of course, the new book. I'd like to ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Feenberg.
Thank you, Anne. I'm pleased to be here. We're going to talk about ancient history, but hopefully there'll be some similar repeats of the experiences that we had in the 60s as things heat up. So I'm going to read the text, and then Anne and I will have a conversation, and we can have some questions. I'd like to make sure I understand how to do this. It should be able, yeah. Okay, it works. So, I first met Marcuse in 1965, shortly after he joined the philosophy department of the new University of California, San Diego, called UCSD. The move to the palms and beaches of Southern California seemed to contradict the gloomy pessimism of his writings. But in person, he was not gloomy at all. I recall my surprise at his ironic humor and the rejection of the exaggerated gestures of respect that some students believed appropriate for a German professor. Marcuse was an outstanding figure at UCSD, both as a political inspiration and as a scholar. His uncompromising criticism of the war in Vietnam made him a hero for the left students on the campus. But his courses were rigorous. In the classroom, he was simply a dedicated teacher of the history of philosophy. My own initial encounter with Marcuse was strictly academic. He had studied with Heidegger in his youth, and soon after arriving at UCSD, I asked him to read Heidegger's Being and Time with me. So this is the Humanities Building where we met to talk about Heidegger every week. We had big disagreements. Despite his scholarly commitment, Marcuse became a target of conservative criticism and was eventually expelled from the university in a complicated maneuver designed to placate Governor Ronald Reagan while preserving the appearance of academic freedom. Marcuse viewed Hegel, Husserl, and with serious reservations Heidegger as great idealist philosophers with whom he was still engaged in dialogue. Here's our friend Hegel. From Hegel, he took the idea that each stage in history lives in the shadow of a better future, the realization of which it obstructs. We who studied with Marcuse found in his Hegelian vision a validation of our own dissent. Our protests were not merely personal, but belonged to history with a capital H. Marcuse believed, perhaps incorrectly, that he took very little from his teacher, Heidegger. This is Husserl and Heidegger. Heidegger was Husserl's student, and Marcuse studied with Heidegger, and with both of them, actually. Marcuse's disappointment over Heidegger's Nazism was never assuaged, yet he acknowledged the importance of Heidegger's false path as an advance to the outer limits of bourgeois philosophy. What did he mean by this backhanded tribute? Marcuse criticized Heidegger's early phenomenological approach for abandoning the concrete ground of history. But there was something right about a philosophy that could resist that hegemony of the facts, the uncritical scientific naturalism that predominated in American philosophy. And Marcuse's own most radical speculations on what he called the new sensibility of the new left implied a phenomenological concept of lived experience, what he called an aesthetic Lebenswelt. Some of us were immunized against positivism with a therapeutic dose of phenomenology we learned from him despite his own skepticism. Even before he became famous, Marcuse was the star of the UCSD philosophy department. His erudition and charm gained him the respect of many scientists in this science-dominated university. His speeches at rallies against the war in Vietnam were attended by hundreds of students and eventually thousands on our rapidly growing campus. Here's Marcuse with his talking to the students. We knew how fortunately we were to have such a teacher, and I think he was truly dedicated to us, despite our clumsiness and naivete. He took his intellectual mission seriously, but he also demonstrated with us for our causes, which were his as well. You can see him over there, with the policeman in front, at one of the rallies on the campus. When his student, Angela Davis, was accused of murder and placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, he defended her publicly, attracting undesirable attention on the right. I have a few slides here about, this is Marcuse with Angela. And the undesirable attention took the form of a hanging in effigy. Can't really see it very well. Let's go backward. Can't get it to work. Well, there's a slide from the show in which you can see him hanging in effigy from the Great Hall building. And this is the panel that they put on the body. Marxist Marcuse. And we call him Marcuse. When his life was threatened, his students showed up to patrol his house. When he was fired from the university, we wanted to protest, but he discouraged us. He had worked out a deal, allowing him to finish his work with his last graduate students. I benefited from this deal. His priorities were clear. Marcuse is remembered today primarily for his remarkable prominence during the late 1960s and 70s. Few philosophers have achieved such fame. He was not simply a public intellectual, he was a media celebrity, precisely the sort of thing he criticized in his work. I was present when he first discovered his paradoxical status. He was already well known on the left and in the academy in the United States and Germany, but he was not yet famous in the world at large. He arrived in Paris for a UNESCO conference on Marx in early May of 1968, just as the largest protest movement of the 1960s broke out a few blocks from his hotel. That's the UNESCO building, and this is what was going on next door. On entering the main conference hall, he was swarmed by journalists with cameras and notebooks. Unbeknownst to him, he He had been the object of a press campaign in the preceding week, which painted him as the idol of the students in revolt. That's the Nouvelle Observateur, famous journal. A few weeks later, the newspapers published articles refuting their own inflated estimate of his role. Observing Marcuse's discomfort at this unexpected attention, a young reporter whispered in my ear that he would be happy to let the professeur escape. When he promised not to ask any questions, I agreed to relay his message. We soon found ourselves in a small car fleeing the scene, to Marcuse's great relief. The reporter offered to take us anywhere in Paris. Marcuse asked to meet the North Vietnamese delegation to the Paris peace talks, which had just begun. At the desk of the Lutetia Hotel, we requested an audience with the Vietnamese. That's the fancy hotel they were staying in. They sent us the delegate responsible for public relations. He was a small, extremely thin, poorly dressed fellow who could not have looked less like a diplomat. These are some of the delegation to the Paris peace talks. You can see that they don't look like the people you see on TV. The delegate opened the conversation by complimenting Marcuse on his great age. Marcuse was taken aback. He did not think of himself as the Ancient of Days. On the contrary, after a further exchange of compliments, the conversation took a political turn. Marcuse warned the Vietnamese not to count on the American working class to end the war. His interlocutor nodded in agreement. No doubt the Vietnamese had reached the same conclusion long before. On the walk to his hotel afterwards, Marcuse was recognized by the students who had just seized the École des Beaux-Arts. So that's the art school in the center of Paris. And this is what they were doing in there, creating posters, attacking the government. The poster says, the police post themselves at the Beaux-Arts, because the police invaded the Beaux-Arts. The Beaux-Arts posts in the street. So the students at the Beaux-Arts invited him to address their General Assembly. He greeted them in the name of the American movement and praised them for rejecting consumer society. This puzzled the Maoists in the audience, who were seeking a Chinese-style worker-peasant alliance against French capitalism. Marcuse presented a rather different notion in his UNESCO talk, entitled Re-examination of the Concept of Revolution. He argued that the revolution was no longer just a matter of replacing one ruling class with another, but also concerned the technological underpinnings of the system. The continuity of domination could be broken only by transforming the repressive technological infrastructure. This talk at the UNESCO conference first got me seriously interested in technology. I have pursued the subject ever since. Marcuse's Marxism was very different from the orthodoxy that prevailed in most of the French left at the time. Like his Frankfurt School colleagues, Horkheimer and Adorno, he had lost hope in proletarian revolution for the foreseeable future. Here's the members of the Frankfurt School. Advanced capitalism had integrated the working class. Consumer society offered benefits, to be sure, but it blocked radical change. The move beyond capitalism to a democratic form of socialism made possible by the very same technological advance that delivered the goods. The new contradiction of the society, succeeding the now muted struggle between capital and labor, consisted in the contrast between its immense wealth, sufficient under socialism to provide everyone with security and leisure, and the unending competitive scramble for an ever-increasing supply of private commodities. To the extent that this contradiction becomes conscious and provokes resistance, the society is threatened. Marcuse soon identified this threat with the French May events of 1968. This was the last major outburst of opposition to advanced capitalism. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it started as a student strike, and workers joined the strike. And after a few days, all the factories in France were closed down. The workers simply took over the factories. They locked the front gates, wouldn't let anybody in, and put out red flags above the factories. And this lasted for weeks, and practically overthrew the government. Didn't quite make it, but there was a serious revolution in France in 1968. The slogan of the revolution was "All power to the imagination." That's one of the posters made by the art school. And this is, of course, exactly Marcuse's idea, imagination in power. The events, like the New Left, prefigured the generalization of the consciousness of freedom. 1968 was the messianic moment in Walter Benjamin's sense, if on a small scale, that only prefigured the future. It laid down the horizon of progressive possibilities for our time. Marcuse paid tribute to the activists who animated this movement in the preface to his most optimistic book, An Essay on Liberation. He recognized himself in the students rebelling around the world, who in turn recognized themselves in this figure from a heroic past. Here's Marcuse with some of his students. That might be me, but I'm not sure. Young people rejecting consumer society and the capitalist rat race found in him a confirmation of their own political commitment. His confidence in the validity of ethical and social ideals and his call to defend them challenged the prevailing cynicism. What was it about Marcuse that made him a symbol of this movement? He was not flamboyant, and he did not seek publicity. His writings were considered obscure, and although his books sold widely, it is hard to believe that they were widely read. 300,000 copies of One-Dimensional Man were sold. Two things made him such an attractive symbol. Certain of his ideas converged with the sensibility of the movement, and he emanated a kind of personal authority. He was not only old, he was a German philosopher who had lived through some of the major events of the 20th century and survived to tell the tale. It is easy to dismiss the enthusiasm of youth, but not so easy to ignore the fidelity of age to the dreams of youth. This is where Marcuse, like his friend, the Marxist literary critic Lucien Godeman, differed from many of those who attended the UNESCO conference. In the middle of one tedious panel discussion, Godeman expressed outrage that we were merely discussing revolution while the real thing unfolded outside the conference hall in the streets. Remember, pounding on the table. Godeman's outrage was justified in the weeks that followed. Soon after the end of the conference, I participated in a march from the Sorbonne to the famous Renault factory in Boulogne-Billancourt, occupied by striking workers along with hundreds of other factories. So that is that's an image of the student group that made it to the factory, and those are the workers up on top. They didn't let us in, but they yelled at us, and we yelled at them. And that's me reading a tract of leaflet behind this guy here. I think there's another picture. Yeah, that's me, the existentialist. I used to smoke. Not all the participants in the UNESCO conference took it seriously. After Marcuse left Paris, I met a well-known Italian Marxist in the courtyard of the Sorbonne, which we students had liberated a few days before. I was full of enthusiasm, but he complained that we had created a carnival, not a revolution. So this is the courtyard of the Sorbonne. You can see why he thought that. Adorno's notion that the movement was a form of pseudo-activity had a certain currency among older left-wing intellectuals who failed to recognize themselves in its slogans, demands, and crucially, its style. Marcuse did not share our confidence that revolution was around the corner. But he appreciated our spirit and found traces in it of the negativity advocated by the Frankfurt School. Certainly, Marcuse understood the extent of the crisis better than those who dismissed it. As he later explained, it was merely a coincidence that his ideas linked him to a movement he no more than others had foreseen. But what a coincidence! Marcuse called for a less repressive society that valued peace and pleasure over war and sacrifice. He argued for eliminating the competitive pressures and acquisitiveness of rich societies in which poverty could finally be eliminated and work transformed into a creative activity. He protested inequality and media manipulation and analyzed their causes in the structure of the system. These were all themes of the movement. Indeed, they quickly became cliches. They were developed with philosophical rigor in his books and speeches. Much has been made about Marcuse's ideas on sexuality. This is his book on Freud. He is remembered mistakenly as an advocate of the sort of orgiastic excesses associated in the public mind with the movement, if not actually enjoyed by many of the participants. In fact, he anticipated some of Foucault's most counterintuitive conclusions about the politics of sexuality in modern societies. He introduced the concept of repressive desublimation to explain the instrumentalization of sex by the capitalist system. He argued that the intense focus on sexual attractiveness and sexual activity was not liberating, but was part of the larger process of containing libidinal energy within the confines of the existing society. Of course, Marcuse opposed the sexual puritanism that still held sway in America, but he also sounded the alarm over exaggerated expectations of sexual liberation. The shared dystopian vision of American society constituted the most interesting of the coincidental convergences between Marcuse and the movement. This is One-Dimensional Man, his most famous book. The New Left experienced America as a closed system, a one-dimensional system, capable of repelling or absorbing opposition. Marcuse belonged to a tradition of dystopian critique, which had long expressed such notions. Like Aldous Huxley, he saw a threat to individuality in the rise of modern technological society. Cultural pessimism of this sort was rare on the left, where most Marxists still celebrated technical progress while anxiously awaiting proletarian revolution. By contrast, Marcuse emphasized the role of science and technology in the organization of a repressive system. These themes appealed to a generation of young people who grew up in the America of the 1950s, when the ideology of progress was at its height. We were masters of the atom and had put a man on the moon. No less significant was the integration of labor unions into consumer society, which demonstrated the obsolescence of socialism. These achievements announced the end of history, the triumph of the existing society over its own utopian potential. To many in the New Left and the counterculture, radical change seemed both necessary and impossible. But paradoxically, by the end of the 1960s, the dystopian vision of isolated social critics like Marcuse was echoed by the mass movement. For that movement, the struggle against the war in Vietnam became a surrogate for the struggle against the imperium of technology at home. Beyond these convergences of ideas, there was a peculiar charisma about his person, evident to those at the many protest meetings at which he spoke. He did not indulge in the emotional gestures and rhetorical flourishes of a political orator, but addressed his audience soberly, as someone authorized by historical experience and philosophical reflection. This stance made a shocking contrast to the content of his discourse. Here was an old and presumably wise professor calmly advocating revolution in complacent and self-satisfied America. But perhaps something more profound was at work in Marcuse's astonishing presence. He had participated as a young conscript in the Berlin Soldiers' Council in the German Revolution that followed World War I. Here's some images from that revolution in Germany, which was unfortunately unsuccessful. Marcuse had fled the Nazis and worked for their defeat during the Second World War and for the denazification of Germany afterwards. He had criticized both post-war American society and Soviet communism as failed realizations of emancipatory ideals. Few of those present at his speeches were aware of the details, but these accumulated experiences seemed somehow expressed in his person, in the deep and strongly accented voice that spoke with authority of the European disaster and foretold a similar fate for American imperialism. Marcuse's presence evoked a kind of mentorship. He taught by example the value of a life of political engagement. These impressions of his impact can be explained in terms of the theory of experience he shared with his Frankfurt School colleagues. They worried that modern life had damaged the capacity for experience. Presumably, in earlier times, a richer and more complex relation to reality was available. Walter Benjamin was the source of this critical notion of experience. So there's Benjamin and the famous Paul Klee painting that he loved, which shows the angel of history looking backward at the disasters that have been accumulating ever since the beginning of civilization. Benjamin distinguished between Erfahrung, experience shaped by a deep relation to reality, and Erlebnis, experience as a momentary response to passing sensation. Erfahrung registers the real at a subconscious level and changes the person who undergoes it, while Erlebnis is a defensive response to the speed and shock of daily life in modern society. Erlebnis has no resonance and quickly slips out of consciousness as new experiences challenge the subject. These characteristic modern experiences leave few traces, in contrast with Erfahrung, which has existential depth. Marcuse represented the possibility and the result of a rich and deeply reflected political Erfahrung, something not yet available to his young audience. Marcuse's long political history and deep knowledge of Marxism made for occasional disagreements with the young revolutionaries who received him with so much enthusiasm. He constantly exhorted them to attend to theory and work on organization. Anti-intellectualism and ritual anti-authoritarianism are false paths, he said. Spontaneity is good, but organized spontaneity is better. No, sorry, rock concerts do not prefigure socialist community. It is foolish to fetishize violence. It has a place in defense of the right to protest, but terrorism under democratic conditions is not a political weapon, not a legitimate political weapon. I could continue, but these proved to be minor disagreements. Despite them, Marcuse remained in solidarity with the movement, which he called the true historical heirs of the great socialist tradition. As such, the New Left had something to teach Marcuse. His historical experience was not yet older. His involvement in the New Left represented a final chapter in which his own ideas underwent a further transformation. What did he draw from the movement? Here we have his own testimony, many articles and books written from the late 60s until his death in 1979. These texts testify to a revision of his earlier dystopianism. The one-dimensional society was challenged at the level of culture, if not effectively at the political level. This is a slogan from 1968, Plutôt la vie. I'm not sure how to translate that. Better life, rather life, rather than what's the alternative, the existing crap. This is the culture of the movement. Plutôt la vie. Cultural revolution here means politics in the depth dimension of the psyche, at the level of needs and identities. Marcuse had argued earlier that advanced capitalism reached down into the very instincts with its promised paradise of consumption. The manipulation of consciousness by the system leads to the internalization of social control. Now, he claimed, this overwhelming force of social integration was answered by a new form of resistance. This was not simply a matter of political opinion or intellectual critique, but more profoundly, an existential revulsion at the destructiveness of the system. The New Left mobilized new tactics against this psychic oppression. Instead of a unified socialist party based on the labor movement, it put forward demands emanating from various marginalized sectors of social life, such as minority communities, youth, students. Their actions were more or less spontaneous and so difficult to prevent. They innovated new ways of attracting attention in the absence of access to the mass media, such as dramatic, even clownish demonstrations of dissent. Here's some examples. Students having fun, making a revolution. And this was a particularly spectacular display of comic spirit. They ran this pig for President of the United States. His name was Pegasus, and he was apprehended by the police. New forms of sociability flowered, such as collective living spaces known as communes. New media appeared, the so-called underground press that carried the message outside the regular channels of information. So you see, even without the internet, you could do things. So that was the magazine that we created at UCSD with Marcuse's help. And this is some of the writers with Marcuse gathering around for a dinner. And that's a little later, a newspaper that was created. You can see there was an interview with Marcuse in this newspaper. So these were the ways in which we managed without the internet. Of course, Marcuse never imagined that students could overthrow the system. He always insisted that revolution, were it possible at all, could only be the work of the mass of the population. Rather, what the New Left and the counterculture revealed was what he called a new sensibility, that, if generalized, would destabilize the society and expose it to revolutionary transformation. This theory, explained in an essay on liberation, was an implicit response to the pessimistic decline of experience in his earlier work. The new sensibility, rather than the old idea of class consciousness, now constituted the threat to capitalism. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that Marcuse reinterpreted the notion of consciousness in this richer form, revealed by the contemporary movements for radical change. Marcuse made his earliest contribution to Marxist theory while studying with Heidegger. This was a new theory of the revolutionary disposition, which challenged the traditional notion of class consciousness. This is in the late 1920s. Under the influence of Lukács, Heidegger's concepts were given a Marxist interpretation. Inauthenticity was understood as reification, overcome by the transforming or radical act. This was Marcuse's appropriation of the Heideggerian notion of authenticity, which he interpreted as a fundamentally critical stance toward the existing world. What excited him about the New Left was the return of an existential politics, a politics of global refusal of the existing society and the identities it supported. The individual's very being rebelled at the conformist pressures of the post-World War II world. Their resistance was expressed not simply in discourse or strategic calculations, but in emotion and action, and had to be so expressed. The simple fact of negativity was not significant in itself, but what lent its significance was the rejection of war and racism, the demand for a just society that privileged solidarity over competition, and the hope for a pacified relation to nature based on a less destructive technological disposition. Marcuse conceived this as the determinate negation of the existing society, the potentialities blocked by the system. Interpreted in terms of the moral and aesthetic tradition, the new sensibility of the New Left represented a new form of individuality and a new mode of experience that challenged capitalist reification and its consequences in the pursuit of a more humane society. The new sensibility was informed by the aesthetic imagination, which opened up the aura of possibilities surrounding the facts of life established by capitalism and the technological system that supported it. Why aesthetics? One commentator on Marcuse's work writes, quote, "The construction of a free existence is an aesthetic undertaking in that it is guided by criteria which traditionally have characterized works of art." End quote. Perception was no longer confined to the given, but had become critical in terms of these criteria: beauty, harmony, focus on the essential. Alternatives to the oppressive structures of the society appeared thinkable once again. The individuals regained the mental independence required to break with the rituals of conformity that bound them to the system. The personal had become political, as the participants in the movement like to say. The New Left thus renewed the power of the negative, the driving force behind history. But for Marcuse, it was not enough for the personal to become political. It was also necessary for the political to become technological. Here his thought joined that of the most radical participants in the movement. After 1968, he amplified his earlier, rather abstract remarks on technology. At a time when many Marxists were skeptical of environmentalism, seen as a diversion from the class struggle, he argued that the technological domination of both human beings and nature traces back to the same source, the indifference of capitalism to the essential potentialities of life. But Marcuse was no technophobe. He did not propose a return to pre-modern conditions. Rather, he argued that the imagination could inform technological design and realize the values of the movement in the very structure of the machines. A technology respectful of human beings and nature could replace a system adapted to competition and war. This would be a technology of liberation, capable of supporting a modern society without reproducing the domination inherited from the past. These speculations on technology turned out to be prescient. A generation of environmental protest has refuted old deterministic and technocratic notions. There is a new spirit of concern for nature, and whether it is compatible with capitalism as we know it is very much in question. Today we are in the midst of a vast movement to transform technology in response to climate change, although it is not clear that this will have the radical consequences Marcuse foresaw. Perhaps technology is another scene on which the dystopian logic of advanced capitalism has the power to absorb all opposition, but perhaps not. What are we to make of these late developments in Marcuse's thought? His ideas seem remote after the last 40 years of increasingly reactionary political and economic developments. Yet the horizon of radical politics has not shifted much since his day. Marcuse argued that despite its collapse in the mid-1970s, the New Left would leave its mark on the future of radical politics. He wrote that the New Left differed from earlier socialist movements in, quote, its insistence on the subversion of experience and individual consciousness, on a radical revolution of the system of needs and gratifications. In short, the persistent demand for a new subjectivity. End quote. And he said the New Left called for rebellion and change in human existence and redefined the concept of revolution. These consequences of the break with the old left persist today. For the most part, political activity no longer takes the form of party militancy, but consists in a sort of punctual protest against the dominant way of life that characterized the New Left. We still hope for many of the changes it struggled to achieve, feminism, racial equality, environmentalism, various democratic alternatives to capitalism, all survive as ideals, despite what Marcuse called the preventive counter-revolution that responded politically to the rise of this new form of capitalism, of radicalism. Marcuse's philosophical contribution to the early Frankfurt School is now overshadowed by Benjamin and Adorno. Their ideas influenced him, but his political thought goes far beyond theirs. Benjamin's politics are revolutionary, but only sketched in brilliant aphorisms. Adorno's polemic against identity embraced not merely the repressive capitalist version of social unity, but any harmony not confined to the ideal sphere of art. As a result, it is difficult to relate his thought to politics. Marcuse retained and transformed the classic philosophical project of reconciliation of individual and society, human beings with nature, and subject with object. His fidelity to that project explained why he is the only member of the Frankfurt School to have elaborated a revolutionary political theory. The eclipse of Marcuse's thought represents a startling reversal of fortune. Hundreds of thousands of copies of his books were sold, and he was, for a time, the public face of the Frankfurt School all over the world. This looks like a Japanese edition, but there are many. This is Chinese. It's Chinese. Yeah, there are many all over the world. His books were translated. These books were not mere popularizations, but difficult and innovative philosophical works. Yet with the passing of the historical moment in which the Frankfurt School reached a wide public through his work, he is too often dismissed. An academic culture that values difficulty and dismisses utopian thinking finds him hard to appreciate for lack of these dubious qualities. And as the left declined, the Academy became the main audience for radical philosophy. Was Marcuse the naive romantic he is often taken for today? A romantic, yes, but not naive. He was well aware of the danger of underestimating the obstacles to a radical transformation of the human condition. Bruegel's famous painting of the fall of Icarus hung on the wall of his dining room. It shows the barely visible legs of the fallen hero as he plunges into the ocean, a punishment for flying too close to the sun with his artificial wings. I don't know if you can see him. His leg is there. And here's a peasant going about his business. Perhaps the painting reminded Marcuse of the warning implied in Audun's poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts. Audun writes, quote, in Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster, end quote. The message, idealists beware. There is serious irony here, the irony of someone who has suffered terrible disappointment, but not given up hope. Why not, after all the tragic catastrophes of the 20th century? There are two motives that stand out. The belief that nature and life contain active forces working towards survival and fulfillment, and the belief that these forces are echoed by universal reason. To give up would be an unjustifiable betrayal, paid for in intellectual complacency and abject conformism. Marcuse once wrote, quote, critical theory preserves obstinacy as a genuine quality of philosophical thought, end quote. The obstinate refusal of intellectual compromise characterizes his whole life and work, despite so many unfavorable circumstances. Samuel Beckett detected this essential aspect of Marcuse's stance and commemorated it in a poem. Here's the poem. In English, it reads, step by step, nowhere, not a single one knows how. Tiny steps, nowhere, stubbornly, obstinément. On Marcuse's gravestone is inscribed, Weitermachen, keep on going. Marcuse had a unique stance within the Frankfurt School. He drew productively on the whole tradition of Western philosophy and charted direction for the future. That stance is relevant today in a new period of political activism, much of it posing questions around issues involving technology. Whether it will take on the existential depth he identified with revolutionary possibilities remains to be seen. Philosophical understanding can and must contribute to this movement. It is high time for a fresh look at Marcuse.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for walking through all of that long history with Marcuse. It was wonderful reading your book over the weekend as well. I'm going to start with a few questions before we open it up to the rest of the audience. I wanted to sort of begin with the period and the time that you encountered Marcuse in the 60s. You mentioned May 68. You mentioned the period with Angela Davis. Of course, the governor of California at the time was Ronald Reagan. He even named Marcuse a particular moment. So I'm wondering if you could share a few stories, because when you see the moment now, people like Ron DeSantis, naming certain academics, the stuff gets read into the particular moment. When you think of that time, to share some stories about the kind of particular political moment where he was being targeted politically.
Yeah. Well, it was a strange period, because the war sort of overwhelmed everything. It was, a lot of people died, including 500,000 Americans and maybe 1 million Asians. And it was very different from the wars that have happened since, when the government has been very careful to make sure that, if 8 Americans die, it's a big deal. In those days, it would be on the newspapers. 500 Kong killed. This kind of thing was commonplace. So in that atmosphere, most people seemed to accept the war. It was popular at first. And so Marcuse's stance was very unorthodox. But I remember that there was a physicist on campus who was actually a family friend who was for the war, and he and Marcuse had a debate in front of the students. And Marcuse, of course, won the debate. But it was, at first there were just a few of us, a dozen philosophy students who we made that magazine, Alternatives. We put that together. We called ourselves the students of the independent left. And but gradually we got more and more people going. Eventually we were the hegemonic group among the students. But it took a while, because the propaganda about the war was so intense. There were all kinds of things going on. There was a group in the science department that was helping to better target missiles, bombs landing on Vietnam. Well, that was protested. The CIA tried to recruit on campus and protest. I think that might have been the protest where you saw Marcuse with the policeman. One student, in imitation of the monks in Vietnam, killed himself in the quadrangle in front of the building that I showed where Marcuse and I discussed hydrogen. So it was a very intense period. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm wondering perhaps if you could maybe share a little bit more also around May 68 in terms of Marcuse specifically being there and kind of his role in the time there.
Yeah, that was a real chance. It just so happened UNESCO thought Marx was sufficiently dead you could have a conference on him. Just at that moment, there's a revolution going on right next door. So when Marcuse arrived, he had no idea that, there are students in the halls all the time in the 1960s. But this one got way out of hand. And was relayed by the working class. And so the atmosphere was incredible. The gasoline was not available. So there were no cars. No cars in the city. Garbage was not collected either. The middle class people began to get involved somehow. They began to feel the pressure, you know? If the population, the students and the workers are all against the government, what are we doing? We're in the middle here somewhere. Executives or people in ministries. I was present when a group of executives, they had a union of executives. Everyone was a union in France. So they had a union, and these executives broke into the headquarters of the union and called for a general strike of executives. So there were quite a few episodes like that, which meant it was really a very different phenomenon from just a student revolt. It was actually a kind of collapse of the social system. And for me, it was an incredible feeling. You know, Benjamin's notion of the messianic moment, which I registered in the talk. Well, that was for me the messianic moment. I mean, suddenly it occurred to me that nothing was solid. Everything was up for grabs. If people decided they didn't want to obey, the society would simply cease to exist. And that's exactly what happened. No one was obeying anymore. And that was, it completely just blew my mind. So,
in the book, you have there's a technical chapter, and you say it in the preface, and as I went through it, that the one that's titled Marcuse's Marx, and you also go into the different ways that he decided her, and others. We, of course, don't have time to go through all of the details, but maybe let's focus on this particular reading of Marx and what you're trying to do in that chapter in terms of how he utilized his work.
well, of course, the most important text of Marx is Capital, which explains, or thought it explained, tried to explain how capitalism would fail, would collapse. But in 1844, Marx wrote a short text, a bunch of notes, which were not published at the time. They were published by the Russians in 1932, and Marcuse he was studying with Heidegger at the time, and he just written a thesis on Hegel, and these notes came out, and they were a huge revelation, because they showed that Marx had a philosophical theory behind the economic considerations and social theories that you could find in Capital. And so Marcuse was one of the first people, I think maybe the first person, to write a review of this text and explain what Marx was doing in 1844. And you know the concept of alienation, everyone's heard of this concept. It comes from that text. Before the 1844 text was published, people did not talk about alienation. That wasn't part of the Marxist discourse. But after 1844, text was published, it became a really important concept, because what it showed was that Marx was not just worried about economic considerations, you know, about the problems of the working class and poverty and exploitation, but he had a more general theory of human nature and what human nature should be like, and how it should be, how society should be organized to accommodate what a human being really is. And so for Marcuse, who was studying with Heidegger, whose Being in Time, his book Being in Time, was all about exactly that question. This was a revelation. Now, Heidegger's idea was not the same as Marx's in 1844, obviously, but the notion that you could have a sort of a philosophical anthropology that would explain what it is to be human and obtain some sort of normative development out of that anthropology. That idea was already central to Marcuse's thinking in the 1920s and early 30s. And now he had, from Marx, he had something which made it completely clear how to do this. And so a lot of what he did afterwards was a break with Heidegger, but also you could see that he used some concepts from Heidegger and from Husserl to try and understand what Marx was doing in 1844. So that chapter is an explanation of how Marcuse tried to sort of turn the 1844 manuscripts into a modern text, which could resonate with the things going on in German philosophy in the 1920s and 30s. And so, I mean, that's, in other words, make the text actual, not just a historical document, but something that you could actually live by.
That relationship to Heidegger, of course, was very strained. He obviously famously wrote a couple of missives sort of confronting his old professor, and maybe he was a little bit more sympathetic a little bit later. But there was the period, oftentimes as it gets talked about, Marcuse, that after the Second World War, when he worked with the Office of Strategic Services, which was a predecessor to the CIA, which is part of his sort of denazification work, and going back to Germany, some of that writing's been published and available as originally written in English. You've seen people speak of that period. There was somebody in Barrington Moore who came to speak on campus. But wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you read that period of his life working with the government. And one that he came out of it was obviously Heidegger critical of, as you encountered in San Diego.
Well, the military, in those days, intellectuals seemed to be more prized than they are today by governments. The U.S. government felt it needed to understand Germany and Japan. It needed to understand fascism. It needed to understand a lot of things intellectuals knew more about than soldiers and businessmen. So they invited these people to come and work with them. Ruth Benedict, for example, wrote a famous book about Japan. It's called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. She wrote that book while she was working with the Office of Strategic Services. And Marcuse was one of the people who was asked to make sense of the German system. And so he spent quite a bit of time in that during the war. He was not fighting, he was trying to help people understand what to do with the Germans. And after the war, they had a denazification program. And Barrington Moore was a famous historian, was also part of this group. And he described to me once, when Barrington Moore came to UCSD for a lecture, how he and Barrington Moore had worked together on the denazification program, none of which was ever implemented. So they were not surprised.
Before I open it up to questions, my last question to you is just, you talked often about how Marcuse is relevant today when you think about the present political moment, sort of the attacks on universities, not just in the United States, but in various parts of the world. Given your encounters with Marcuse, how do you yourself read him into the present political moment?
Well, I think one thing that's quite important is to understand that Marcuse was not in favor of cancel culture. He felt that the university was one of the few places where you could have debate. And even if you could not control the debate, you could participate. And that was going to have impacts on students. And so he, as I said, he had this debate about the war in Vietnam, an advocate of it. It did not bother him at all that there are people who disagreed with him. I mean, obviously there were things beyond the pale. You know, you would not have had a debate with some racist who wanted to explain why white people were better than everybody else. But within the range of things that you could normally debate, he was happy to be part of it. And I think that's quite important because your book called Repressive Tolerance, which has been misunderstood as authorizing the rejection of debate and the refusal of debate on university campuses. So I think Marcuse felt the university was a very important place to, and you had to do the best you could. Given you would, of course, you could assume that the dominant ideology of the university would be that of the society, not yours, but that of the dominant groups that run the society. But if they left you a space within which to argue against their position, you should take advantage of that and try and have an influence. And of course, he did have a very big influence, even though the UCSD was, I mean, fully integrated into the Pentagon. So, nevertheless, the students on the campus were profoundly influenced by his presence there. So I think he would say the same thing today, that nothing has changed really. Of course, if the university no longer wants to have debate and won't have people who disagree, well, then it's, you know, then it just becomes like another business. But for the most part, universities are not like that. Maybe in Florida, not here in Canada. So there's still chances for argument, to argue.
We'll take some questions. If you just put your hand up and maybe identify yourself, and if you could get to a question, that would be ideal.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to how Marcuse was able to connect with Black politics in ways that other first-generation Frankfurt School theorists were unable to. I'm thinking notoriously of C.L.R. James and Adorno having an acrimonious lunch. So why was Marcuse able to make that connection in ways that others weren't? Thank you.
Boy, that's a hard question to answer because I don't really know exactly what was wrong with Adorno and Horkheimer. And of course, Benjamin died before the issue could be raised. There were some other people. Leo Loewenthal, I think, was more, who lived in the United States. And perhaps it's just being in the United States, being in the presence of all this terrible racial discrimination. It's, again, difficult to imagine what it was like. I mean, I lived in this, most of my childhood in a city that was maybe, I don't know, maybe a third black. And the only black people I ever saw were gardeners and maids. There were none in the schools. So this is, so, you know, for someone with the political ideology of Marcuse to actually be up against this, to live in the midst of this. And then that's not all. UCSD was in a region of San Diego that had covenants against selling homes to Black and Jewish people and Mexican people. Only white people were supposed to be allowed to buy homes in this region of San Diego. And before the governor would allow them to have a university, which they wanted, you know, it's big business, right? Lots of construction jobs. He demanded that they remove this restriction. So Marcuse was living in a house that he was only allowed to live in, he was Jewish, because they had eliminated this prejudicial restriction on people like him. So if you're living in the United States, you know, it maybe makes a big impact on your thinking in a way that someone like Adorno who was in Germany just couldn't really understand.
To what extent did Marcuse anticipate the evolution of capitalism into a more ominous form of a neoliberalism?
Yeah. Well, he wrote a book toward the end of his life called Counter-Revolution and Revolt. And in that book, he presents this theory of what he called the preventive counter-revolution. In other words, you see that people are getting hostile, so you have to do something to push back before it gets out of control. So the counter-revolution included things like making work more precarious, so people would be concerned about their personal life, their personal situation, rather than worrying about society. Controlling the media more carefully, and so on. He had this whole theory. It's not exactly neoliberalism, which nobody talked about at the time. It didn't exist in the 70s. But it was an attempt to figure out how capitalism was trying to move from a consumer society based on an ideal of prosperity to one in which people would be more controlled, better controlled by their economic and social situation. So that book is actually still interesting from the standpoint of what happened. What happened? Why did the system evolve in such a negative direction when it's, you could have imagined things evolving in a very different way had the consumer society idea, the welfare state idea been pursued. Instead, it was shut down in order to regain control. So you had people like Ronald Reagan taking over.
So thank you very much, Andrew. That was a wonderful talk, and especially appreciate your staging of disappointment versus hope as a kind of structural, long-term dilemma for people interested in revolution. But if you think back historically, let's go 1968, and then 1989, and then 2008, and then the election of Mr. Trump. Don't you think what you just described as the forces of counter-revolution have in fact been far more revolutionary than the forces of socialist or humane revolution itself? In other words, I wonder if one of the problems on the left is not taking counter-revolution seriously enough. Hasn't, we'll call it revolutionary capitalism, been able to absorb, every hopeful moment in this kind of ongoing ingestion of various impulses, right? So I wonder, in other words, don't we need a sharper attack on counter-revolution to help us, especially in this moment, beyond hope, but more in the direction of action, more in the direction of, I like your phrase, organized spontaneity, more in the direction of that sort of resistance.
Well, certainly the idea of the one-dimensional society was Marcuse's attempt to understand how you could turn a population into a bunch of passive victims of their own society and love it. And one-dimensionality maybe is a good concept to deploy in understanding what's happening today. But the weirdness of what's happening today is that the counter-revolution has produced its own troops. And so we have this very strange situation in which the people who should be resisting the system have been co-opted by the system. So, and they are not part of this one-dimensionality. They're antagonistic. They're fighting against the terrible things being done by the society. Only the fight consists in voting for Donald Trump. So the level of insanity that has been reached on a mass scale is so much greater than what anyone could have anticipated in the 1970s. I mean, if you look at that book that he wrote in the 70s, there are some hints. You know, he's aware that there's a kind of craziness involved in the public sphere. But it's much worse now than he could have anticipated. So what should our response be? I mean, this is a very difficult question, isn't it? It's one thing to call for a reason, you know, say these are the facts, and it's another thing to actually confront people who are completely closed off, because they belong to a kind of cult. So this has been seen before. This was Germany in the 1930s. I don't know. I guess I'm not able to answer the question because I don't think anyone really knows. I wish there were big mass movements of essentially of young people concerned about the climate, because that's the big elephant in the room, right? It's not the war in Vietnam. We're not fighting that war anymore. We're in fact allies of the Vietnamese now. There's no country that we're really interested in invading. So, but there is a big issue, and it's the environmental issue. And so, were there to be the kind of movements that emerged in the 60s and early 70s around environmentalism, that might actually shock the system to some other configuration. But since that isn't happening, I mean, there is an action, but it's on a small scale. It's not on the scale of movements, like the May events or the anti-war movement. But, I mean, I think that would really, for me, because that's my history, right? That would be the solution, but I don't know how to make it happen.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm not sure how to ask this, but you kind of hinted that you kind of embraced what we would call identity politics today. And what I was thinking about was, and it might be a bit of a response to the previous questioner, what passes for the left now appears to pay less attention to class than to all these various identities. And what would he think, and is that part of the reason that a lot of what we would bluntly call the losers in society voting for their oppressors, that they've been forgotten by left-wing politics or progressive politics? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, in other words, citizenship is a form of identity politics. Well, at the time when Marcuse was thinking about these issues, the movements of black people in the U.S. were seeking support and solidarity. There were, of course, people who were pretty antagonistic to the white population in general, but even they were, were interested in finding allies. So the idea that there could be identity politics and solidarity with other people was part of the thinking of people like Marcuse or Angela Davis or others who were involved in left politics at the time. There were, of course, a lot of people who didn't agree, who just wanted to be their own identity and shut out everybody else. And there were lots of conflicts around the thing. But it still was, it seemed, for people like Marcuse, it seemed that you had to affirm the identity of black people and also affirm the importance of solidarity beyond any one race or social group. And that was a plausible position to take at the time. Now, by what seems to have happened in more recent years is that identity has become so overwhelmingly important to people many people on the left that it no longer really plays a role, a political role. It's a personal thing, it's a moral thing. It's something I wish to hammer on people you don't like. And this is politically completely useless. It's even worse than useless. But somehow, on the other hand, you can't just say that you could just go back to the proletariat. Somehow we have to get back to a notion of solidarity, of identity and with solidarity. And maybe that could happen, I don't know, but it's not, certainly doesn't seem happening right now. And this is one of the main reasons why the left is so impotent. Yeah. And this was when the new left collapsed in the mid-1970s, this was partly the reason. Everybody's identity was more important than everybody else's. And so they bullshitted their way to insignificance. And I guess that heritage continues. And although people today probably don't have any idea of what happened in the past.
Thanks, Andrew. Did Marcuse know of the genocidal colonial history of the U.S. and to the extent that it inspired Hitler and the Nazi movement? And if he did, did this bear on his work with the OSS and CIA? And again, if he was aware of that, was he maybe hoping for some sort of self-reflection of the American government to sort of denazify Germany by itself?
I never heard him mention any connection between the genocide of Native Americans in the U.S. and what was happening in Germany. The Germans had plenty of precedents of their own. They didn't need Americans to tell them how to do it, or what the problem was. So I doubt if that was part of his thinking, which doesn't mean it isn't significant. It's just we probably know more about it now than we did then. As for denazifying the American government, of course he was all for it. That was the whole point, was to transform the American system. But there was not the agent of revolution available to make that happen. What was available only was these smaller movements of black people, students, and a little later of Mexican Americans who could try and make people uncomfortable, right? Get people aware that there was a problem. They couldn't actually overthrow the government. But I think he was hopeful that at some point in the future, maybe, but see, with the original Marxism that came out of Capital and Engels' work and Lenin and so on, had a very clear sense that they were going toward a revolution. That idea just completely disappeared in Marcuse's thought. You're not going toward a revolution. It could happen. It's a contingency. But there's nothing going on now that would guarantee the forward movement. So and I think that's realistic. And that was certainly realistic in 1964 when he wrote One Dimensional Man.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is for Marcuse's ecological politics in today's era. And the biggest change in my mind being obviously the ecological crisis in the 2020s and going forward. Now, at the time of Marcuse, the environment was relatively stable, and we're moving into a period of more instability and everything like that. So my question would be, how do you use your imagination, think utopia, and what would the ecological sensibility look like in an area where, in a time where there's this sort of collapsing of possibilities that seems to be being brought on by increased scarcity and everything like that. So, yeah, how would you do that in this time?
For Marcuse, the human relation to nature was very critical. It was also something that you find in Marx's 1844 manuscripts. So he was sensitive to the challenge of the environment, which was beginning to be noticed. There was beginning to be a small environmental movement in the 1970s. And he wrote 2 speeches. He made 2 speeches about the environment. And in those speeches, he argued that the forces of Eros were engaged against the forces of Thanatos in the environmental movement. That we had to preserve and cherish life, and the technology that we were operating with in capitalist society was not doing that. It was destroying it. So these speeches include also some discussion of the possibility of what to do. You know, and he says the environmental movement has to persist within the society and take advantage of whatever it can within the society. But it may be that capitalism is simply unable to stop destroying the environment, and this may lead to revolution. So he thought of the environmental movement as somehow a possible source of revolutionary change. But no, I mean, he was not technophobic, right? He didn't think that people should just stop using technology or something like that. He felt that whatever reforms could be made should be made, but the clear understanding that the system was not really oriented towards saving the environment.
Thank you very much. My question is I'm wondering how you think that some of us have started following ecologically attuned critical theory might orient itself in relation to somebody like Jürgen Habermas, in particular, in his earliest books.
Well, I've not read his latest books. The books that I've read seem to me pretty useless from an environmental perspective, because he had this notion in the theory of communicative action that there were social systems like the money system, the market, the bureaucracy, and these were okay if they did not intrude on the everyday life of the individuals in their family life, in their political life, and so on. So you had the idea that you have a sort of bipolar society. On the one hand, there's the things that work by a kind of mechanism, like the market, and on the other hand, things that work through communicative action among individuals. And this doesn't really make sense today when we think about the environment, because the theory of communicative action doesn't even mention nature. It's not in there, not in the index. I actually talked to him about this many years ago. I asked him, I said, I've been teaching theory of communicative action. It's a wonderful book, but I can't find anything in there about technology. And he said, I didn't really know anything about technology when I was writing that book, and there was no one around to help me, so I just sort of left it out. So this is the way the world spirit operates. So what we need is not a theory that sort of neutralizes the technical systems of capitalism, like the bureaucracies and the technologies. And what we need is a theory that integrates the public sphere and the technical systems, that shows how they operate together, how they can be made to work together. And that's the last chapter of my book is about this. I'm trying, using some concepts from Marcuse, to think about how we can integrate the public sphere and the technical dimension of the society. In order to have a modern society, but one which is less destructive.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing your work with us.